like to call the meeting to order. I have 5:30. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the budget workshop for this year, and especially welcome our new members, Emily Kyoko, Eliza Kaczynski, Councilor Yi, welcome back. So I'd like to turn the mic over to our newest members just to say a word.
So hi, I'm Jennifer Ye, and I am the newest council member here. And I can't remember what Scott told me I was supposed to say. Is that good enough? Yes, I know. All right. Who should I point it to? Yes. This way?
Emily, are you on the phone?
Yes, I'm on the phone. Hi, this is Emily, and I'm hunkered and sailing right now, and also with a new member.
And I'm Eliza Kaczynski, and I'm also a new member of the Budget Committee, and I'm happy to be here.
So as you can see that we are being recorded and broadcast on the webcast, so please speak clearly, wait for the mics. We do have some mics in the center of the room that pick up sound, but it'd be better if you speak into the mic that we're passing back and forth. Bathrooms are out in the lobby. We also have some food up there. Trash and everything's out there as well. Just please come and go as you see fit. I'm going to turn it over to our city manager who's going to talk about the purpose of the workshop.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everybody back into the new budget season. As you may know, we don't always have a budget meeting or a budget committee meeting this early in the year. Occasionally we did as we went through the recession. But we thought this time it'd be a nice opportunity to just give you a little bit of an update on where we are with our financial forecast, and then based on that forecast, our strategy as we move forward, and what you'll generally see when we actually meet more formally and present the budget in April and May. So that's really the purpose tonight, is just to give you a bit of an overview. From our perspective, it's not really the time that people are putting out motions and trying to express where they think all the dollars should be spent, partly because we won't have all the information today. But it is an opportunity to at least provide some initial information, initial strategies, as well as gather input from all the budget committee members on what you would like to see as part of that more formal budget committee meetings later on in the spring. So we look forward to tonight's discussion. We are here to primarily listen and go from there. So,
Okay, thank you. Next we'll have Jamie Garner. We've asked her to provide an update of some of the activities that we closed out last year with and where we are with some of those. So we're going to turn it over to Jamie. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jamie Garner. I'm the Acting Budget Analysis Manager, and I just wanted to provide an opportunity to go over some of the updates that we've sent out here in the last week or so, and then answer questions, hopefully, that you might have on some of those updates. So we sent out a memo about the community justice presentation to council, so hopefully you saw that piece, as well as an update on the fire and EMS transport system. Public housing was also included in that memo. That's the $1 million for the public shelter. There was a human services update. It's not yet on City Council's agenda. And we also updated you on the budget visualization tool that you passed a motion for last year, and the progress on that being that we're going to release that when we release the FY19 proposed budget. Additionally, we provided a memo about incorporating more of the CRO measures into the capital improvement program, so the CRO being the Climate Recovery Ordinance. And we provided an outline of those measures and what we can measure. And we also, for the citizen members, provided an update on 6 different public safety service profiles as well. So the councilors didn't see that. That did just go to the citizen members. So I wanted to open it up. We wanted to save the bulk of the time for questions on any of these items, so I wanted to open that up at this time and see if there's anything that we can address for you.
How exciting, I get to kick things off. I'm curious when is the most appropriate time to have a discussion of the memo on the CIP connection? I don't know if that's tonight or in a future meeting.
We can start tonight. If it needs to be longer, we could look at maybe something in the future. But the intent was tonight that if you had any questions about some of those outstanding items from the prior fiscal year, we do our best to address them now so we could move into conversations about the upcoming fiscal year.
Okay. Should I give, well, and this is really, I guess, a question for budget staff generally. Should I give, I mean, you know, we just got this memo. Should I give feedback out loud tonight? Would you prefer to sort of defer it and get it in writing? What feels best to you guys?
It would be great to get it in writing. I think that would be helpful.
Okay. I'll do that. I'll send it around to all the budget committee members. The one thing I would ask for right now, and I don't know if there's any of this that needs to happen before the end of the fiscal year, but it's probably better for me to say it now than to wait. I know it's a while before the next CIP, so this is good. We have lead time, but if there's anything that would, any deadlines sort of in this year's budget process that we need to meet in order to give productive feedback on this, that would be really helpful. I'd hate for us to get to the next CIP and have missed an opportunity to give feedback about integration of the CIP with our climate goals.
Thank you. Any other questions on any of the updates that went out?
Thanks for running. So what's the timeline on the CIP work?
So staff usually begins compiling information for the CIP in late summer before we present it. So that would be around the July, August area of this year, of 2018.
Okay. Because that motion was 6-month time report back, which was 7 months ago. So when will we hear back from staff about the actual work that's being done, other than the memo that we got?
So we publish the CIP every 2 years. So the memo itself outlined our plan for how we would implement the recommendations or the requests from the budget committee with the CRO. So if there's additional information that's needed around that, we could certainly look into it. But our goal would be that it gets published in the FY 20 through 25 CIP, and that would be presented to the budget committee, I believe, in winter of 2018.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. At a 30,000 foot level, we had, as you mentioned, printed information, and council had a presentation recently on the nature of the first stages of a longer conversation we need to have about public safety. My take on that presentation was a situation that seemed as though it was in need of more attention than waiting. And so I wonder from the manager, are we going to do a lot more work as council over the course of the next several months on that subject? Or should we be trying to address any kind of preliminary things in the short term during the budget season? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the opportunity is a little bit of both and so I think from our perspective, the community justice public safety conversation is one that's going to have to evolve over the next several months because it's a heavy lift, and there, as we noted last time in the presentation, there are a numbers of things if we want to bring the whole system up to capacity to meet some pretty important objectives in the community. With that said, part of what we will be doing as part of this budget, we'll be trying to particularly make some one-time investments to sort of do a little bit of a bridge, so we have an opportunity to bridge across as we're having those conversations. So that's why I say it's a little bit of a bulk conversation as we move forward.
Thank you.
Anything else? Great.
Well, actually,
Oh, yeah.
I'll do one more. I didn't know if I was kind of waiting for everyone.
We'll just leave this in the corner over here.
Yeah. Does someone have a Sharpie? I can put my initials on this. So we had some conversation about seismic preparedness and public buildings at the meeting a year ago. And I brought up some questions and felt that that should have been represented somehow. We didn't have a specific motion, but I'm just curious if there are updates. I just haven't seen anything else. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, we don't have a more recent version of the unfunded needs assessment. So I'm just checking in about that. Again, I'm doing it now. This may not be the appropriate time. Tell me if there's a later time that's better, but I didn't want to let the opportunity pass.
So I can't remember if there will be seismic improvements in the FY19 UNA, but the UNA, the unfunded needs assessment, will be published with the FY19 proposed budget, so you will get an update at that time on any outstanding unfunded needs.
What I think we also can do is pull out all that emergency preparedness things, not just with the CIP, but there's some other things that we're doing from an emergency preparedness perspective, and just provide a separate update to all the budget committee over the next several weeks and bring that together. And if you have specific questions, submit those to us as well. But in addition to that, we'll just provide a general update on the topic to the budget committee over the next couple of weeks.
Okay, and just as a quick follow-up comment, the specific request that I had last year that I know was not feasible last year was that we should have at least ballpark figures for what it would cost to do seismic retrofits for all the buildings that would require them to be prepared for a major Cascadia event. And that, to me, is the essence of the kind of thing that should be in the unfunded needs assessment, because it's not a perfect number. We think the first 5 significant digits are true, but it's a rough sense of scale of how much we need to spend. So I think the community should know that. So that's what I brought up last time. I realize if it's not in the unfunded needs assessment already now, it probably won't be, but I think it's important to sort of state that general need.
Okay. Good. No more, Josh? Okay. All right.
It's only my point.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Twyla and John to talk about the financial condition update then.
And this is a workshop, so we're going kind of informal. There's no timer, so just feel free to raise your hand. We'll acknowledge you and ask the questions. If a question goes too long and we need to move along, I'll just kind of nod at you. Just take that as a polite nudge that it may be somebody else's turn to ask a question, and then we'll come back to you for the second round or third one. Okay?
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, and we'll get some slides up here in a moment. Or I can get some slides up here in a moment. Thank you, Jen. Okay, so good evening. I'm Twyla Miller. I'm the Acting Finance Director to the city, and I'm here tonight to give you an update on our financial condition and the general fund forecast. The city manager will then provide an overview to our approach about fiscal stewardship and the FY19 budget process. And after our presentation, there will be plenty of time for questions. I do want to remind folks that this is a preliminary forecast that we're talking about this evening. Finance staff are still in the process of updating the general fund forecast, and we will bring a more in-depth financial condition update when we come back with the city manager's proposed budget in May. Generally, when we talk about the forecast or the financial condition of the city, we're talking about the general fund. The city's budget is organized into over 30 reporting funds, and they all fit into the categories that you see up on the screen here. And the blue boxes represent those funds that are represented that account for revenue sources that are legally restricted for specific purposes or to account for operations funded by users of the service through fees and charges. The general fund is used to account for all of the resources that don't fall into one of those other categories. So this graphic represents the FY18 adopted budget for the city this fiscal year. You can see the general fund represents about 1/3 of the total budget, and the general fund is the largest fund of all the city funds. It consists of the main subfund, the cultural services subfund, and the equipment replacement subfund. And today when I'm talking about the general fund, I'm talking about the main subfund, which is really the discretionary resources for the city. So the city prepares a 6-year forecast for the general fund. This is a planning tool that projects our financial condition based upon what we know at a point in time. The forecast helps us make a projection about how much the city will spend and receive over the next 6 years based on what we know today. Of course, as we move through the out years of the forecast period, there's less certainty about the assumptions that we're using. Staff and the executive team use the forecast to understand the long-term impact of the decisions we make today and to model how potential choices may impact the organization's fiscal health in the future. We update the forecast twice a year, once in the fall at the beginning of the budget development process, and again in the spring when the city manager presents his proposed budget. And in between those times, we're actively monitoring all of the variables that impact the forecast so that we can adjust our course if we need to do so in a timely manner. And while there are hundreds of variables that affect the financial forecast, such variables such as property taxes and inflation have a greater impact on our financial condition. We also use the forecast to monitor 2 important financial goals for the city. The first is, are we living within our means, or are revenues greater than or equal to expenditures over the forecast period? And the second is, do we have an adequate savings account? Our target for the general fund is the reserve for revenue shortfall, and our target there is 8% of general fund expenditures, or about $13 million on average annually. So these graphs represent the forecast both at the proposed budget last spring and the FY18 adopted budget. You may recall that last spring we were anticipating a future budget gap of $2 million over FY19 and FY20. This forecast incorporates those $1 million reductions in each of those years to address the gap. This forecast also incorporated budget recommendations and decisions of the Budget Committee and the City Council, including $20,000 in ongoing expenditures, $2.3 million in one-time expenditures, as well as direction from Council to include $750,000 in fiscal year 19 as an additional year of one-time funding for the ALS ambulance that was included in the FY18 adopted budget. If you look to the left, this graphic represents our progress towards our financial goal of having revenues greater than or equal to expenditures. After incorporating the adopted budget changes, we started off FY19 in a surplus position, and we're stable through FY21 by using the surplus to offset the PERS rate increases in FY20. However, without further action, the forecast was in a deficit position beginning in FY22 due to the next PERS rate increase. The slide to the right shows the reserve for revenue shortfall for our savings account. The reserve for revenue shortfall is our financial cushion in the general fund, which is a key part of our financial management. Having an adequate reserve allows us to weather unexpected events and to take time to develop thoughtful and strategic responses to events rather than having to take immediate action to cut services. Well, over the forecast period, we were above the 8% target. Without further action, the deficit continues to deplete the reserve. As a reminder, the reserve for revenue shortfall was increased by $16.5 million on SB1 in FY17 as a result of a large one-time payment from a Comcast court settlement. So as I said, the forecast is a point in time, and we all know that things change, and so some things trend upwards and some trend downwards. So I'll talk about some of the major changes between last spring and now. Property taxes are the largest revenue source in the general fund. This fall, we did receive good news from the tax assessor when we learned that the City of Eugene's taxable property value for FY18 increased more than we had projected last year. This results in almost $600,000 in additional revenue in FY18, which grows to almost $2 million by the end of the forecast period. Right-of-way license fees are fees paid by firms that utilize the public right-of-way. Comcast agreed to begin paying ongoing right-of-way fees on internet services as part of the legal settlement. We previously were anticipating $1 million a year from this revenue source. This has been increased to an additional $1.2 million a year beginning in FY18 based on experience. Although this is good news, there is uncertainty around this revenue source, which I'll talk about a bit later. E-Web SILT, or contribution in lieu of taxes. SILT revenues are actually trending downward slightly for FY18 by about $150,000 and $550,000 in FY19. This decrease is due to a change in eWeb's rate assumptions. Last year, their forecast assumed rate increases in those years, and this year, those rate increases are not there. So SILT is lower. SILT revenue can also vary based on electricity prices and weather patterns. Next, we'll talk about GEMT. So after new state legislation, ground emergency medical transport revenues, or GEMT, were expected to begin in FY18 when we came to see you last year with the forecast. GEMT is a voluntary program that makes supplemental payments to eligible providers who furnish qualifying emergency ambulance services to Medicaid clients. Negotiations are currently in process to develop rules and payment processes for revenues, so we aren't expecting to receive any revenue this fiscal year. We had previously projected $925,000 for this revenue source, and in the future years of the forecast, we've lowered that to $400,000 pending further experience with the revenue source. Next, we'll talk about marijuana taxes. You may recall that we were very conservative last year with our marijuana tax revenue projections due to the uncertainty around the new revenue source. And the revenues we received this year will exceed those projections. For the local marijuana tax, we increased projections to $425,000 a year, and those will likely come in higher. For the state marijuana tax, we budgeted $100,000, but we anticipate receipts this fiscal year of $900,000. This is in part due to a back payment of $500,000 for FY17 activity. We will budget $400,000 for the state side in FY19. We will continue to budget conservatively for this revenue source due to a few factors. One is we've only received 2 distributions this year of this revenue, so we'd like to have at least a full cycle so we can see the seasonality of the revenue. Marijuana retail prices continue to fall due to the proliferation of producers and retailers, and then there continues to be uncertainty at the federal level. So next we'll talk about some of the changes on the expense side. So PERS rates are adjusted every 2 years in the even years. The most recent advisory rates received this fall projected higher costs for PERS rates as compared to our previous forecast. And we are still anticipating large PERS rate increases in FY20 and 22. However, with new information from the actuary, we are holding PERS rates flat in FY24, rather than increasing rates in that fiscal year. In 3 of the 4 scenarios modeled by the actuary, PERS rates were held flat or decreased, which is a significant change from previous modeling from the actuary. This is due to steady return rates. The modeling is taking into account 2017 investment returns, which are strong. Through the end of October, they were 12.5% compared to the rate of return for the system of 7.2%. Staff will continue to monitor this over time and make adjustments as needed. Another change on the expense side was lower internal service fund rates. Our internal service funds represent costs to the general fund for things like fleet operations, employer insurance costs, and health insurance costs. Fleet costs are decreasing from previous estimates in part due to stable fuel prices, and risk and health insurance costs are lower due to better than expected claims experience. So incorporating these costs, of course, these reductions are a positive impact to the general fund. And then finally, I talked just briefly about FY19 budget strategies. So after incorporating all of these changes in the forecast, some of them major, some a little smaller, there was no longer a gap in FY19 and 20 as we had predicted last year. The graph I'll show you in a moment no longer incorporate the $1 million in reduction strategies. And additionally, we've added $1 million in one-time strategies for FY19, which the city manager will talk about a little later. So now that we've talked a little bit about what changed, let's look at the current forecast. So the solid blue line represents projections at the time of the adopted budget, and the dashed green line is the current forecast, which includes all of those changes I just talked about. If you look to the left, which is the new with the new forecast, we remain in a surplus position until FY21 without implementing budget reductions. This is really great news. However, beginning in FY22, we still see deficits growing. This is primarily due to the increase in PERS rates in 20 and 22, which now expect level off in FY24. If you look to the chart on the right, you'll see our reserves are also projected to be maintained at a higher level, but decrease towards the end of the forecast period. So in addition to PERS and deficits in the out years, the staff are also monitoring several areas of risk and uncertainty. The first I'll talk about is the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. The FCC may take actions that have the potential of impacting the city's ability to charge telecom companies for use of the right-of-way. While the timing and details of potential FCC action are currently unknown, we believe that the FCC could take action to partially or completely preempt local government's authority to charge right-of-way use fees that are not cost-based. The city's annual telecom license fee is not cost-based, as if we calculate that as 7% of a licensee's annual gross revenues. So if enacted, such an action could have an impact of anywhere from $2 million to $4.2 million to the general fund annually, depending on the action that is implemented.
Say that again?
The impact to the general fund could be from anywhere between $2 million and $4.2 million annually to the general fund. So while it's premature to take action at the moment, we're not sure on timing or magnitude. Staff will continue to monitor this area very closely. Another area we're looking at is our union contracts. We do have 3 bargaining units whose contracts will be negotiated over the next couple of years. When there's not a contract in place, the forecast ties to inflation. So if there are changes there, the forecast would look different if anything different than inflation. Another area would be ballot measures. Upcoming ballot measures, if passed, could have a financial impact to the city, which have not been incorporated into this forecast version. And then deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance remains an ongoing challenge and risk for the general fund. The average age of general fund buildings is about 33 years, and almost 25% of the buildings are 40 years old or older. And then finally, something we always watch is inflation. Inflation does appear to be rising after a long time of historic lows. And so while that's a good indication that the economy is improving, higher inflation means a higher cost for the city. For example, a 0.5% increase over the inflation rates we have in the forecast now would translate into about an $8.5 million impact to the general fund over the 6 years of the forecast period. So given that there are several areas of uncertainty, we wanted to show the impact to the general fund if some combination of those events were to come true. This chart shows the impact of the surplus deficit in $1 million increments. The green line is the current version of the forecast, where we're in a surplus position through FY21 before falling into a deficit. A shift of just $1 million moves that line down, so over the forecast period we would be in a deficit the entire time. And with each shift, the magnitude grows. So this slide shows the impact on the reserve for revenue shortfall over the forecast period when $1 million of ongoing impacts is implemented in the forecast. If you look to the percentages on the far right, those are showing the reserve percentage, the reserve for revenue shortfall percentage in FY24. So if you remember, our target is 8%. And we don't like to see the minimum target we like to see is around 5%. We wouldn't advise going below 5% for your reserve for revenue shortfall, because remember that's your savings account or financial cushion. So the green line again represents the current forecast. Under our current forecast modeling, our reserve for revenue shortfall target would be at 8.3%. With no mitigating action, and ongoing impact of $1 million would leave the reserve for revenue shortfall at 4.8%. In FY24, and of course that gets worse with each increment. So this chart shows our reserve for revenue shortfall over the last 6 fiscal years. Prior to the Comcast settlement, you can see our reserves were generally below our target. As we were coming out of the recession, our revenue growth remained slow, and as a result, reserves were sometimes used to minimize disruptions to our service system. We've avoided the temptation to use one-time monies for ongoing expenditures, and we've made difficult choices to realign the budget. As a result, we're in a good position with our reserves in a large part due to the Comcast settlement, which now allows us more time to make lasting course corrections without abruptly reducing services or making overcorrections in the near term. By prudently managing our reserves, the city is able to maintain budget stability and flexibility.
Just a quick clarification. All of the graphs on slide, oh, sorry, thank you. All of the lines on slide 10 include the Comcast settlement. That's correct, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Sorry, I mean, I guess I feel it's important to call that out, in part because slide 11 unfortunately came after slide 10 and also is in a different page, which is why I'm flipping back and forth. So it's a little bit of an illusion. I guess I would encourage everyone to think about how that looks without the Comcast settlement, which maybe shouldn't really be considered in the same category as the other stuff. It's, I mean, manna from heaven, totally awesome, but gives us a false illusion in slide 10. Anyway, that's all. Not a false illusion, just an illusion. It's a true illusion, I guess.
So with the FCC, are we looking at an administrative ruling, or is there congressional oversight or input into that decision? Do we know how that would happen?
It's the FCC.
It's strictly FCC?
That's my.
Do you want to answer that, Catherine, with that microphone, please?
I can certainly try. As we understand it, it's the FCC, so it's an administrative. It's not congressional.
Okay.
Can you refresh our memory where the 8% target comes from? Did we make that up? Is it a national standard? Just a refresh.
Right, so we look at a range of things. There was actually a budget committee many years ago. There was actually a budget committee discussion about the reserve. And so we look at our rating agency, we look at what other jurisdictions have done as a best practice. There's a range. It depends on each organization's a little different, but given our mix of service and other levels, we've looked at a range of best practices and rating agencies to determine that 8% seemed like a reasonable target.
I just want to give Emily a chance to weigh in since she's on the phone. Emily, if you have any questions, the floor is yours.
No, this is here listening, and like all the questions, they mirrored my own. So it's really helpful. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Josh, did you have something?
Yeah. So just so this doesn't slip by, and again, I was just checking with Scott because I'm not entirely sure where this goes in the conversation. You all saw an email that I sent out asking if we might think a little differently about franchise agreements and the fees that we're charging for use of the right-of-way for both Northwest Natural and Comcast. I appreciate the news on the possibility of some sort of FCC preemption. That would be unfortunate in a budget sense, obviously. But I am curious, you mentioned a range, Twyla, where if it were cost-based, that somehow we already have those calculations. You said between 2 and 4 point something.
The range I gave was between 2 and 4.2, but it depends on the action that's taken by the FCC. So there are a range of actions they could take. So depending on which piece they move forward, that would impact, that would direct the impact on the city. So we're estimating that it would be somewhere in that range, but it depends on what they move forward.
Okay. And we have no indication on timeline on this at all, right now? Okay.
Correct.
So I guess I want to make sure that stays on the table, and I'll while we're talking about franchise agreements, I'll just mention that I had put out there both Comcast and Northwest Natural. I would encourage everyone to think about the fees we charge and how they connect to policy objectives. With Northwest Natural, there's this clear connection to our climate goals. On Comcast, it's a little fuzzier, but it's also something where be easy to make a policy case or a political case that those fees should be higher. I'm wondering when we're going to explore that and whether that is something that becomes an offshoot of the budget committee, the way we've had a revenue committee in the past. I just want to comment on it before it drifts by, because it's millions of dollars. It could be higher if we charge the franchise fees that exist in other places. And you saw on slides 9, 10, 11 that we have a budget shortfall coming. So when and where should we have a conversation about how we give input on renegotiation of franchise agreements with those two companies?
What I think we'll need to do is probably give that a little bit more thought and come back sort of partly with the legal analysis on how we're able to impact those, and then have that kind of a discussion. So I think we'll just need to do a little bit more work on that. I guess as far as I know, I don't know if any of us right off at this moment could articulate the legal parameters about renegotiating any of those fees for franchise agreements.
Okay, well then I guess it's really mainly a comment for counselors. This is why I sent it out almost a month ago, so people would have a chance to think about that. I don't see an exact point of connection with the budget process right now, but I would just say this is, these are fairly, these aren't huge, but they're not tiny, and if we were to increase the rates, it would make a difference in our budget. It would show up on the lines that you put up.
Yeah, and I think it's worth exploring. I just don't think we know the response at the moment, but it'd be a good topic to explore. A couple things before I get on to mine. Once again, I'll give my mantra. I think this is a great example when we talk about ongoing versus one-time monies. And those of you that have been on the budget committee for the last 8 or 9 or 10 years, I know that's one of our steadfast consistencies is use one-time money for one-time costs, because what happens is if you don't and you add an additional $1 million of ongoing revenue or expenses, where we are right now, we automatically get into we're not living within our means to any part of the forecast. And so it does matter in these particular circumstances. So make that plug. So based on all that Twyla talked about, I think from our perspective with the general fund, we would say we're in that yellow status or that caution status. And as she briefly talked about, last year as we came into the budget based on that forecast, we had forecasted a $3 million gap over the forecast period. We, as execs, and when I presented my budget, built in $1 million reduction in that in this year's budget, and then anticipated $1 million over the next couple of years. And so the reason why we didn't try to fill all of that at once was, one, we had some reserves that we had maintained, and so we were able to use reserves to give us some time to continue to be thoughtful about that. Throughout really the whole recession and after the recession, one of our hallmarks has been is to not overcorrect and create other issues that would come up as a result of that. So we had sufficient reserves that we were maintaining, and then we just continue to manage as we go. As Twyla mentioned, for this coming budget, we would anticipate 0 gap, so that's the good news. But by the same token, based on particularly the PERS in the out years, we know that there's a couple of significant PERS adjustments in FY22 and 24, as well as potential FCC impacts. What I would say is, yes, no gaps, but we're not flush with money. And that we need to be cautious about that. But by the same token, we've been here before, and we haven't panicked in the past, and so we sure don't need to do that now as we think about going forward. And here's the approach. Some of you have been around for a while, know this approach. We're we're really taking the exact same approach to this year's budget as we have for the last 10 years. The council, the budget committee, and staff have all used this as our guiding principles since the recession began, and it really has allowed us to responsibly and reasonably manage the city's financial resources. And I'll just remind us of each of these pieces. So that first part is that guiding philosophy that says throughout we want to continually maintain and balance maintaining our community services. And so what that has meant for us is rather than just doing wholesale elimination of services, we've really tried to recognize that all the services we provide in our community are important for community members, and we continually want to maintain those. And we've balanced that also with employee satisfaction. And this particularly during the recession, what we did and what we said is we didn't want to lay off employees, although we reduced our total footprint by 100 FTE during that time, and currently have the lowest FTE per capita than we've had in 30 or 35 years. We did that with very few people involuntarily leaving the city. So we manage that very tightly. We know that it's important that we keep our employees because they're the ones that actually provide the services. And then we said we need to balance that against our financial stewardship, living within our means. And we've been conservative, but I think reasonable in our approach and not overcorrecting. So that's been our guiding philosophy from day one. Our budget principles are ones that you know about. We use a 6-year forecast, so we're not only taking a look at today and tomorrow, but we're looking at 6 years out and really trying to get a sense of what's the impact of financial decisions that we make today on the long-term position of the city. We focus a lot on living within our means, particularly in the near term. What that means is that our revenues exceed our expenses. And we do that, and then we also say though, but we need to make sure we maintain a reasonable amount of reserves that help us to mitigate through the difficult times, allows us not to have to overcorrect, and provides a cushion for us to be able to continue to invest. And then the continuing spend one-time money on one-time expenditures. If we don't, that's where we find ourselves getting wrapped around the axle. But we've also said what's been important throughout the time is not only balancing maintaining our services with our employee satisfaction and the financial management, but we want to continue to strategically invest in the community, often with one-time monies, not exclusively. And if we were to go back over the last 8 or 10 years, what we would find is that there have been a lot of investments. Human services, some of those have been one-time when we do the support of rest stops or our Dusk to Dawn programs. There have been additional CAHOOTS vehicles brought on board and a variety of things. Public safety, although we know that there isn't enough public safety, we also know that we have invested over the time. We did add the whole downtown police team several years ago. We've added additional money for jails. We put dollars into the community justice system with prosecutors. And we've done a whole lot of things to really continually to support the public safety system, both on fire and police. Sustainability, we have continued to try to invest strategically in our sustainability and CRO goals. Part of what you would see is the fleet, the way we purchase our fleet has changed over time. We've been doing some retrofits on buildings to try to really drive down the energy costs, and that's something we'll continue to do. Envision Eugene has been a long project, but as a result, we have continued to invest in that, and over the years, we're doing neighborhood planning. We're moving towards urban reserves. We've done just a whole lot of things in that planning to continue that process moving forward. Neighborhoods, we could take a look at the investments in various projects in neighborhoods as well as neighborhood planning. And then the Baker's Dozen is just a little bit of the generic or economic prosperity initiatives that we have continued to invest in. And so I think what's important through all of that is despite the ups and downs in our financial condition, what we have done is prudently not only manage the fiscal aspects, but we continue to invest strategically into the important things in the community as expressed by our council and the community. And the outcomes have been good. We have a fiscally prudent budget. We can go through the years. As you know, we closed a combined $30 million gap, didn't lay off employees, continually have been strategically invested in the community. We've lived within our means throughout that time. We prudently maintained our reserves. And so all of those kinds of things have been a real positive throughout this time. We've, as part of the budget process, directly and indirectly have contributed to a growing local economy. A good example of that is the investments that the Budget Committee recommended, Council approved in high-speed fiber is a good example of that. There are some investments in the urban renewal district, particularly in the downtown area and eventually over in the riverfront area. And so we have invested in our economy and in the revitalization of parts of our town, and that's paid off. One of the things that we've done is throughout this period, we've maintained a AA1 bond rating, which is really the highest bond rating that a community our size can achieve. And if you think about that through the recession, that was pretty significant. And what that really is allowing us to do is it allows us to borrow funds at cheaper interest rates, which is a savings to our community. It's also a key metric for businesses and companies that are looking to expand into our community. And it shows that we have a responsive and responsible government that is a good partner, and we aggressively manage our fiscal means. We also, and I'll talk a little bit more in a moment, have had successful voter-approved levies and bonds. We've maintained sufficient reserves throughout. As Twyla mentioned, our target has been 8% through the recession. We did dip down to 5%, recognizing that the circumstances were different, but we constantly maintain a sufficient reserves, and that actually, those reserves are allowing us to think about the next couple of years in a caution status as opposed to having to overcorrect at this time. And then one that on staff are very proud of, we do continue to receive various governmental finance association, officer association awards. And just as an example for that, last year, there were over 1,600 agencies that received the distinguished budget presentation. But I think the important part is that we are only one of 5 that have received that award since it began years ago. And so I think it shows not only recently, but a good track record of financial management and stewardship of the dollars that the community invests with us. You know about the successful bond levy, just passed the 3rd one last November. The community has said yes to that. This is a great example of promises made, promises kept. The council was very deliberate in structuring those bonds, levies in a way that were very concrete, specific projects around the community that could be measured, and set up a committee to provide an annual report on those. And I think our Public Works Department has done a great job in delivering those projects, which really earns the trust of the community that says, yes, those are the kinds of projects we want to continue to invest in. We had the levy that as you know from the library, and we put together the 1-year report. We had sent that out earlier just as an example of that. But that's another one of those promises made, promises kept. And so we said we wanted to add hours, we wanted to add programming, we wanted to add materials, we wanted to add technology, and we've done all of that. We've added 22 hours each week into Bethel and Sheldon branches. Sunday morning hours were restored in the downtown. Library visits are up. We've added over 33% additional programming and events within our libraries, a lot of them to our young readers and their parents. And we've been increasing the budget for books and movies and other materials. The kinds of things we said we would do, and those are the kinds of things that are exactly occurring. And so, again, building trust in the community. This is just another example, or the example of the rating that we received. And I think they attribute it to good financial management that the Budget Committee, the Council, and the staff has continued through the years. So this year, from my perspective, what you will see when I present the budget in May, let's proceed cautiously, no gap, but we're not flush. There's not dollars, particularly ongoing dollars, to try to capture. As Twyla mentioned, there are one-time monies that we'll come back with a recommendation on that will focus on a couple of strategic investments that I'll talk about in just a moment. So we need to stay the course, keep using the proven methodology that's been with us for years. It's always important to maintain an appropriate amount of reserves, so that gives us that cushion and that freeboard to be able to manage as we go forward. And then keep an eye on the out years. We do know some things that for sure are going to happen, but make sure that we don't get too inward, too focused, too closely and forget about what's going to happen down the roads, and make financial decisions that really consider the entire forecast period, not just that current year. So when we are thinking about some strategic investments for FY19, these are the things that we're specifically going to target with some one-time dollars around the community justice, public safety, and planning. The planning is, as we think about the Envision Eugene. It doesn't fill all the gaps, so Mike, this was kind of your question before. This doesn't by any means solve our community justice or public safety need. What we're trying to do is invest in a couple of places to help us keep moving, and so as the council continues to have this conversation, we're trying to plug a few holes as we go. Just a couple other reminders of the kinds of things that the council has been talking about that have impacts or have been part of our budget discussions. Recently, the community justice and ambulance system updates, the council saw that. Parks and Recreation operating levy and capital bond resolutions will be before the voters in May. We just talked really last week about transportation SDCs, and so that is a conversation that the council will continue to have over the next couple of months. And then, of course, the Railroad Quiet Zone Council made some decisions around that have budget impacts, and so as we continue forward with the budgets, there's appropriations that will come back to the council for those kinds of things. And so, again, from my perspective, it's a cautious budget. We're in a good place, and the things that we've done in the past serve us well, and I think we stay the course, and that's what you're going to see when we come back in May. And of course, we'll have some specifics around those strategic investments as we continue to think through that. But that's where they'll focus for the most part. So, and lastly, next steps. Releases in April, presentation, then as we always do, you'll have deliberations, and eventually we'll adopt the budget in June. And I think that's where we are.
Entertain questions.
Josh?
You look like you wanted to say somebody else to go first.
So John, there's been a lot of conversation in the community about reserves and maintaining reserves and the level of reserves we have. We're a very, very large organization, $600+ billion organization, so when we talk nominally about our reserve amount, it's a large number. So maybe you could refresh our memory or give us your thoughts about why it's important to maintain reserves at the levels that we do, and what would be bad if we just lowered that target and used it to do other things in the community.
You know, I think this year is a great example of why we want to maintain a sufficient level of reserves. The FCC ruling is a good example of that. We don't know specifically what they will do. There's been indications that they are gearing up to do something. We don't know when and where that would occur, nor the timing that would take place. So a good example might be is if they actually do something that impacts the budget we have just passed, say in June, then we potentially have an entire year of not collecting $2 to $4 million. Well, if you don't have the reserves to be able to weather through that and actively manage it and giving time to be thoughtful on managing that, now all of a sudden you're having to do some knee-jerk reactions on how we're going to try to close that gap without giving it a little bit longer thought. So that's a good example of why we want to maintain a sufficient amount of reserves.
Thanks.
Thank you. Normally I don't need it, but I think all the way home they'll probably need this. This was a really great presentation, and I think for me, what it says is we're in a real holding pattern. And two thoughts that occur to me. The first one is when we actually get to the budget portion, I'm confident there'll be lots of great ideas around the table. And I don't have an opinion on the greatness of the ideas because I haven't heard them yet. But I do know that these great ideas could involve either one-time or ongoing money. And what I'm hearing you say is if we want to adopt one of these great ideas, it probably will be either at the expense of the budget or at the expense of some other thing that we are doing. That then leads to the question that if we say, okay, we want to do this great thing, it's going to have an impact on the budget, so we need to stop doing some other thing. When does that conversation about stopping doing some other thing have a policy implication? And by that I mean, we're basically allocating the money to do all the things we're doing now based on the policies that have been set. If the budget committee goes, well, I think we should stop doing this thing, there's a policy implication to that, and we need to figure out what's the way to do that in as smooth and as clear and clean a way as possible. Because I don't want to stop people from having great ideas, but I want everybody to recognize that those great ideas could potentially have a policy implication if we're going to finance those good ideas at the expense of other ideas.
So what I would think is, as we get into the budget conversation, the committee meetings, as those arise, that the counselors around the table either will talk about, the council's going to also need to weigh in on that. Because the budget committees are just recommendations, they aren't actual decisions that are made, the recommendations to the council. And of course, the council then always has the opportunity or the option to say yes, no, or maybe, depending on further conversation. So I think the council would have that opportunity. To talk about briefly, there will be a lot of good ideas, as there always are in the budget process. It's a good reminder that reserves are one-time money. Reserves are not ongoing monies. And so that's one of those things that is a good reminder to people. And as we come back with what we believe are good one-time strategic investments, it's possible that the budget committee may decide that, well, rather than spending that $10 there, that $10 should go over there. I think that's a really good conversation for the budget committee and one that I think is part of the charge of the budget committee to be taking a look at that.
Councilor Evans.
Our fitness program in action right now. So the FCC, Comcast potential hit that we could get is not the only hit that's looming out there. I know that the flipping of the funding formulas for transportation have more effect on LTD and the state than they would us, but still there's some residual effect there. Do we have any idea if there's any other potential direct hits from disinvestment of federal resources that could affect us locally. I know there's a lot of talk about pushing a lot of the federal piece downhill to cities and counties without providing the resources to support those activities. That's one question. The second question goes back to scenario playing in general, and that is, if we were to get a $2 million or $4 million hit vis-a-vis the FCC for this particular budget cycle, we could close that with reserve for revenue shortfall monies for at least 1 year. But how are we looking at forecasting the potential of that loss over the next 8, 10, or forever? I really want to get some idea of what could be the bottom of the pit, if you will, if the feds go through not only with this action on the FCC part, but other potential actions that have been rumored and are looming in the future that could severely impact our budget capacity and our service delivery.
So I think to the first part of your question, as we know, things like home monies and CDBG, you mentioned some transportation funds. If something is done at the federal level that reduces the flow to us, at the local level, that would have an impact, non-general fund impact. And so we didn't include it in this conversation, but it's still an important conversation. If we receive less home monies or CDBG money, something is impacted. It's just not specifically the general fund. And so that may be an interesting topic for the Budget Committee to have some conversation about as we're coming into this season. And then the second question, I think, is what's the challenge with the FCC is we just don't know. Because what we've been told is there is some movement and some momentum to do something. We just don't know what's the breadth and the scope of that. And so that's why I think your statement is correct, that we would have the reserve for revenue shortfall to give us some time to work through that. Now, if a ruling came out this summer, for example, I don't think we're going to want to wait until this next year at this time to start thinking about it. I think what we would do is come back to this body or the council and talk about, okay, here's the impact. Now let's start thinking about what are we going to do to try to close that gap and have that conversation much sooner than the regular budget cycle. So we do have the dollars to sort of mark time for a bit. We don't have to panic through that. But if it really is a larger $4 million impact, we're going to want to come back pretty quickly and start talking about what are the possibilities with that.
Should we be building a disaster scenario now?
So what?
Just in case that the worst thing happens and we get this $4 million hit, which is, as we know, is tremendously significant because we were wrestling with $2 million last year with funding, ALS and BLS services out of the fire department. Shouldn't we really now be really focusing on at least some basic elementary scenario of what is the worst case scenario?
So what I would say is inside the organization, of course, we're very aware of contingency planning from a financial management perspective. And so we continually think about all of these moving parts and how would we sort of approach that if that were to come to fruition. What I would suggest is I think it could be a good conversation, but it might be good to when we have more information about what could happen with an FCC ruling, that feels like that would be the right time to have it, because if we plan for the worst and it isn't the worst, I also don't want people to over panic around something that they don't really have to panic around, because we will have time to work through it. So we continually think about contingency planning and all of those different variables, and depending on how the FCC starts to move, there might be an appropriate time to come back and start talking with the council and others about, so what does that potentially mean? So I guess what I would say is let's just wait till we have a little bit more information. We do some of that contingency planning all the time, and but then I think we'd have something more concrete to actually talk about, that the council can start providing some policy guidance around some of that.
Check in with Emily. Any questions?
Sorry, still here listening and really enjoying the conversation and following for now. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Josh?
So you had a quick comment, Twyla, about we had a good surprise in assessed value for property taxes this year, and then there was, I remember there was a bad surprise last year. You know, to say it out loud right now, but maybe follow up with an email giving us the math, because it was sort of productive for people to see the magnitude of that the last time it happened, like a year ago. I mean, if you have the numbers, feel free to say them, but I think it was helpful to see like what that mistake meant for the volatility in the budget, or the sort of bad guess.
The property tax from last year to this year?
Yeah. But you remember what I'm talking about? I remember
Right, there was a correction.
Sue sent out a correction last year.
There was a correction,
under-
and I'm trying to remember the number off the top of my head. But we can send it out to you if that's helpful to have that context.
I mean, I think it's helpful. I mean, especially for newer members, it was certainly helpful for me to get a sense of that volatility. And now we have these two examples in the last 2 years. So that was the first one I was hoping for. Also, I was sitting here looking at the graph with the areas of uncertainty, with kind of the picture. It has deferred maintenance. Is this meant as an area of uncertainty separate from things that occur that appear in the unfunded needs assessment? Or, yeah, sorry, slide 8. Or is it just, it's the same things, right? Okay, Sue's nodding. Okay, that's fine. So I guess then, no, that's good that you were nodding. That's helpful. Okay, so I would just say to everyone, as we look at this, there's uncertainty with things that we can't put any numbers on at all, like the behavior of the FCC, and then there's uncertainty that we have that our budget staff have painstakingly documented. And so I would tell everyone to wait in the same suspense I feel for the unfunded needs assessment coming out on fairly short order. Third thing I just wanted to ask about quickly, love the talk of strategic investments. I didn't hear anything about 2021. Are you you're leaving us in suspense on that one as well till later?
No, not intended for that. So the you might remember, was it last year, $500,000 budget committee, and the council said yes, let's move forward on that. And you want to talk a little bit more about that, Sarah, or is there anything that you want to add? So
Well, we haven't added anything in this year. I think the $500,000 that we talked about last year that was adopted is still the number. I'm not sure what your question is.
That was all in 1 year.
Yeah.
So I don't remember the last, you gave an update to the council several months ago, I think.
For those of us not lucky to attend every council meeting, if there were a way to send that out when the budget comes, just to let people know, because I mean, again, you made a great case, and I think Sarah made the presentation, but you guys both made a great case for that as a series of strategic investments. It would be helpful for us to see those. Those strike me as one-time expense.
You have union contracts as an area of uncertainty. Could you be more specific about some of the details of why that's an area of uncertainty?
Because when you go through contract negotiations, you don't know what the end result is going to be based on when you start those negotiations. And so, as Twyla mentioned, what we put into the out years is a cost of living CPI factor into personnel costs, for example. Now, when you actually move through the contracts and there's several moving pieces in that, it may turn out to be more or less, and there may be some other kinds of things that are in those contracts. And so you can't, I've never been in a contract negotiations where you budget 3 years ahead and that's exactly where you hit with the union contract.
Okay, thank you. In your budget that you will prepare, I'm wondering if, and we're in the areas of uncertainty, I think it's a good slide to be on. Will you prepare a budget that both accommodates and doesn't accommodate the potential shifting of 0.1% of the entire city budget for a purpose that may or may not pass in an election coming up?
No, we'll present a budget based on the current situation, and so if it were to pass, then it would be appropriate for the budget committee to make the motion to include the appropriate amount into the budget, and we would just have to put that into the budget.
Okay, so it may become a part of the conversation for the budget committee on what to do to accommodate.
Correct.
600 some odd $1,000.
Whatever the number is, the budget committee, ultimately the council would need to appropriate that.
Okay, but you won't incorporate it in the budget you'll present?
Correct, because it's not a reality.
Okay, great.
Okay, that'll be our last question. We're going to go ahead and take a break, so please be back here at 7. small groups and talk for a while about things that are important to us. I'm going to turn it over to Jamie to talk about how we're going to structure this.
Great, so this is now is this on? Oh, okay. All right, how's that?
Good.
Excellent. So this is the portion where we're going to break out into small groups, and we have a couple of different goals within that. So your first step will be looking at your name tag, because you have a colored star on your name tag. That's going to tell you what group you're going to be in when you migrate to the back of the room here. So like I said, we have two goals. So last year, if you remember, if you were present at the workshop last year, we got a lot of really great information and feedback from the budget committee based on a similar format, so we wanted to do it again this year. Our first goal will be, in your groups, talking about any topics that you would like to hear about in the spring process. So when we get to May, we will be planning for some presentations from staff based on your feedback here. So each group will choose a representative to report out the group's top 2 topics that they're interested in learning about in the spring. And then once we aggregate all of those topics, everybody will then have 4 votes that they can place for the topics that they'd like to hear about. And the ones that receive the most votes, the top 4 votes, will be the ones that we plan to give presentations on in the spring. So that's goal number 1. Goal number 2 will then be that you talk about any information needs that you have related to the budget. So anything that you just in general would like to hear about. So last year, some things that came out of this piece of the conversation, we incorporated the infographic into the budget document based on the committee's recommendations through the workshop, as well as that piece about explaining the changes within the budget, that 5% variance. And then there was also the list of one-time dollars that we removed. So we actually took a lot of the feedback that you provided to us at the workshop last year and put that into the FY18 budget document. We'd like to do that again. We're going to continue to do the things that we did last year, and then we want to build on that to make sure that you're getting the information that you need. So, like I said, take a look at your name tags, find your stars, and then there's a corresponding table at the back here. We have 35 minutes scheduled for you to go ahead and have your group conversation on those 2 topics. Again, the first piece is what topics you want to hear in the spring. The second piece is any information you need you'll have for the appointment to the proposed budget.
I'll say, okay, it's my turn. It's my turn.
committee members, hello, hello. Time to put down your pens and we're going to report out now. We're ready to start reporting out now. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. That was some really good conversation, it seems like. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to have a designated representative from each table, and you're going to tell us your table's top 2 information topics that you'd like spring presentations on. I'm going to notate those on these pads up here. That table. So I'm going to record up to 8 ideas here, and then you will take the budget committee members will take your dots, and you will be voting with your dots. You'll have 4 dots. You'll vote for the topics that you want to hear about. The topics that receive the most votes will be the ones that we move forward with spring presentation. So let's go ahead and start with this table right here. Who's our representative speaking for the yellow team?
I'm on. 2 and 3 on the board here are our top 2. The first one is explore in more detail revenue generating possibilities. And the other information they would like to see more on is downtown security and downtown revitalization, what the city is doing there.
Okay. My handwriting is not great, I apologize. So our first 2 topics are explore revenue generating opportunities and downtown security and revitalization. All right, let's move to the red table here. Go. Sue? Okay.
Okay, we had 2 topics. They started out as 3 or 4 or 5 topics, but we squished them into 2. One would be public safety, which would include police, fire, and the comm center, and also any UNA items related to those things. And then the second topic was infrastructure, and that would include the impact on the budget from deferred maintenance and the impact of increased density on infrastructure as we grow denser in the community.
Okay, so we've got public safety, which includes police, fire, and comm center, and infrastructure, which includes deferred maintenance and density.
Impacts.
Density impacts. Thank you. Okay.
All right, we're going here.
Oh, excellent.
The mint and dark chocolate group. We had our top 2 were homelessness and really an update on what we're currently doing. Basically the sharing of Reagan's memo and expanding on that as necessary. And then the second one was the CRO, CIP, TSP, and their interaction together. And we had another acronym for that, but I can't remember what it was.
Acronyms are faster to write, I like them. So our 2 topics from this group are homelessness and what we're doing in that area, and the CRO, CIP, and TSP and their interaction. Excellent. Okay, our last table in the back corner there. Last but not least.
All right. So we had how to incorporate strategic investments in the budget, and that was particularly surrounding the 3 topics that council discussed more in depth at their goal setting session. So that would be public safety, housing, and homelessness. And we also had funding. I'll let you write for a minute.
The handwriting is getting progressively worse, sorry. So you said homeless, what were the?
It was public safety, housing, and homelessness.
Public safety, housing.
Those were the goals and things that we needed to work on, not council's top 2 goals.
Right, those were the things that needed more work, which might entail one letter. Yeah. And then the other one that we had was funding new initiatives and revenue options.
Okay, so the last two topics, strategic investments and how they're incorporated into the budget, specifically public safety, housing, and homelessness. Josh, you had a...
Yeah, I just have a clarifying question. So I was thinking about these things and doing homework on them and sent an email out nearly a month ago. And at this discussion here, I was trying to listen and not just bring up all the topics that I had already sent to everyone. I'm now feeling a little worried that my topics are now just lost in the ether forever. Is that the case? I mean, you can tell me and I'll go off and be disappointed privately, but I just want to make sure this is our one time to suggest topics for meetings.
This is the spring meeting topic agenda setting. So the goal was that the entire group could hear some of the ideas and then vote on what was their priority for presentations within the spring.
Okay, so I guess just as a point of process, not to be prickly about it, but we have some big policy objectives that council has articulated in the past, and we have some responsibility to the community to bring these conversations back repeatedly and not just to have them be sort of promises that drift off into the ether. And so that was the spirit of my comments about investments in transportation safety and the Vision Zero goal from a couple of years ago, and trying to look at that part of the budget. So I guess I'm just trying to highlight that I don't want this to be, the brainstorm process is incredibly important, and it's incredibly important to have this kind of small group activity, but it also becomes like really disconnected from other things that we've done. So I'm happy to just make that observation for now and leave it to maybe councilors if anybody wants to talk about that.
So there's a difference between information items and these, which are items for discussion, right? So some of the things that you brought up are just, what's the status of this? And the other ones are topics of conversation.
But I don't know that we will, we haven't heard when we will revisit the status of those other topics, so I'm sort of making sure that doesn't drift away. I don't want to get to...
Well, the next flip chart is information items that we brought back the next time, right?
And staff will be, even though we're not voting on the information needs piece, staff's going to be compiling all of those into notes, and I think our plan is to send it out so that everybody has a view of what our priorities, our information needs for the entire budget committee, and then we'll look at what we can incorporate into the budget document or the budget process for that piece. I don't, we can, depending on time, we're running okay on time. We still have the voting piece, so we could potentially do that after voting.
I guess, and maybe people at my table can disagree with me if this is not a good solution, but I feel like our revenue options and explore revenue opportunities are basically the same. And so maybe we can swap out our last item for kind of the other half of that new strategic investment piece with public safety, housing, and homelessness, with the update on the things that were like the climate initiative, things that weren't discussed as goals because they're already kind of in progress. So update on current initiatives and where they are.
Okay, so number 8 here would be replaced with an update on current initiatives.
Yeah.
And is that the table is good with this?
Replacing funding, which is also number 1, with, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so say, would you mind repeating it one more time for me?
Okay. Update on current and previous initiatives.
So number 6 is specific to the CRO, CIP, and the TSP. So this would be a broader look at various initiatives. Okay. Okay. All right.
What's the difference between 3 and 7, or so I want to decide which one of those?
So I'd let the groups decide that. So who, was this group 3? Sue, or? No, 3. Yeah.
Just have like one small friendly amendment.
On the number 1, explore revenue opportunities, I think a piece of our revenue one was around, real specifically around how we fund new initiatives. So when things come up, like a homeless shelter or whatever, it wasn't just revenue opportunities for ongoing kind of operations. So if we could just add that, so it's really clear we're looking at strategic initiatives.
Yellow Table okay with that? Friendly to funding new initiatives on number 1? Does anybody want to speak to number 7? Anybody?
Number 7 for us was, how do we incorporate the areas we talked about in our retreat?
Number 7 was, how do we incorporate the areas that we talked about in our retreat into the budget in a more meaningful way? Because we talked about them, we spent 2 days on them, but they're not necessarily reflected in the budget right now the way we've talked about them. So how do we go about doing that?
Okay, how's everybody feeling about voting at this point? Does this list look good? All right, so budget.
I don't know the news team 3 and 7. They have the same thing.
Can you explain those?
I don't get it.
Ours was specific to making sure that the budget.
Which one was yours?
Number 3 has the same kind of in-depth information that the council on the state of public safety in the same kind of presentation to understand it as a relevant budget priority.
And 7 is...
Well, but it doesn't put in those other categories, and for us, it took a higher priority.
So 7 incorporates 3, but 3's kind of...
3 seems more specific.
They're talking about how do we integrate those 3 high priority items to the council. We're talking about how do we make sure just one of them.
Okay.
There was a priority item. At least that was fine.
Okay. How are we feeling now? Are we?
We have 5 is homelessness. I care about public safety and homelessness. Should I vote for 7 because it's got both?
That's why I was asking 7. We've got both of those up there.
Yeah, 7 incorporates all 3.
How do we make
Well,
the
7 has housing in
which
it
one?
too.
How do we make the distinction?
So it seems like 7 is more about the funding for those things.
I would say that 7 is about ensuring that those things are reflected when strategic priorities are being established of where we're going to spend them.
What she said.
So how do we make the distinction? We could vote it.
Well, if we really want to hear about all 3, you can vote for public safety, homelessness, and safety.
Homelessness is up there separately too.
And that's just public safety.
Right.
Well, we vote and see where it shakes out.
So in these instances where it's a little bit more targeted, you're going to get a more focused presentation from staff. So this would focus probably just on homelessness here, whereas it would be wrapped into a larger presentation here on number 7 with public safety and housing. So it'd probably be the same amount of time for the presentation, but it would be a broader presentation, if that helps. Right. The purpose of this is that staff is going to put together 4 presentations based on the feedback that we received today. So whatever gets the highest amount of votes, and then we'll present those in May at the 4 budget committee meetings that we have scheduled.
Can I just weigh in on that? So my take on the item number 7 as opposed to 5 or 3 is that that we want to actually talk about the financial implications of that focus. So not just an update on all the work that we've done on homelessness, but some understanding of the cost benefit, what are the financial implications of looking at that to us, what might the trade-offs be. So there is a sort of a different level of detail there.
That's number 7.
That's number 7.
Okay. I feel like we're ready to vote. So budget committee members only are voting on this, so execs, sorry, you're not voting here. You've got 4 dots in front of you. You're going to go ahead and put the dots underneath the item that you would like to vote for. So I've got some bars there, try and get it in the general area. And then once you've completed voting, we'll do a tally, and then we'll let everybody know here today what topics we'll be moving forward with planning for presenting in the spring.
One vote per item.
You could choose to allocate, yeah, if you feel really strongly about one particular topic, feel free to use all 4 dots there. So, okay. All right, everybody start your voting. You all can make your way back to the table after you've completed voting, and I'll report out here on the microphone where we stand.
How many are you choosing? 4. It's getting close on code, isn't it?
Oh, goodness, okay. That's very strategic. It is very strategic.
Applause to democracy.
We should redesign this process with an electoral vote system.
You like how the last one turned out?
Yeah, it worked out really well.
Yes, it's been a time over the exercises before.
Emily?
I couldn't hear anything before.
Oh, that's okay. We're just moving you back to the big group here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that was just which part? All of it. All of it.
It looks like everyone has concluded their voting. So go ahead and make your way up to the seats there, and I'll do a quick count here for each of the topics, and we'll figure out the top vote getters.
I think Mike could probably tell us.
Yeah.
That was fun, let's do it again.
We did some negotiating between their eight.
We'll get off camera.
We'll wait till we're on.
Yeah.
So I think we should do 5. But they came up.
Maybe 5, maybe 3.
Do I hear one?
Okay, we have results. So coming in with 10 votes, we have public safety, police, fire, and the comm center. So that's our top vote getter. Tied at 9 votes, we have infrastructure, including deferred maintenance and the density impacts, and strategic investments incorporated in the budget. So public safety, housing, and homelessness. And then finally, we have downtown security and revitalization with 7 votes. So those are our top 4 topics here for the spring. Staff will go back and start preparing something for that piece. I think we ran a little bit long through the conversation that we had here on the voting and making sure everybody understood the initiatives. So we're going to plan to go ahead and type up all of the information needs that came out of each group, and we'll just plan to send that to everybody in the interest of time because we still do have the election of officers piece. We want to make sure everybody gets out of here on time. So thank you, everybody. This is very helpful.
Okay, we've come to that part of the evening where we're going to be electing the next chair of the Budget Committee. Do we have any...
Yes, I have a motion. I would like to propose Scott Norwicki continue as our chair.
Second.
Third.
Are there any others that want to run for the chair position?
Who's not here?
Okay. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, motion's passed. Thank you for that. Vice Chair position, we have one person that's interested, John Jasper. I'll turn the floor over to John to speak.
Here goes the microphone.
I don't know if there's anybody else that'll be interested, but if there are, we'll recognize them after John.
I don't have any. I don't have any great words to listen on, though I'm just trying to help out and I'm enjoying the process so far. Thank you.
Any nominations or questions for John? Anybody else interested? I should back up. Okay. Motion?
Yeah, I move that
You
John
move.
be
Second.
vice chair.
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed? Congratulations, John. All right, that concludes the election. We'll move to the next steps. So our next meeting is Wednesday, May 9th at the library. The city manager will be presenting the fiscal year 19 budget. Since we have 3 openings on the budget committee, so if you're interested and you're on the budget committee, you need to get your application in by the 31st. And if you know folks out in the community that want to be a member, please advertise and market to them so that they know that the deadline is March 31st. Sean has so graciously volunteered to serve as our citizen representative for the Human Services Commission, and he'll be beginning this month, so we have that position now filled. And any other questions, thoughts that anybody wants to share with the group before we adjourn?
I'm sorry, who's going to be on the HSC?
Sean. Okay, with that, since there's no questions, comments, we're adjourned. Thank you.
I am.